This is our first video lecture that I'll be doing. We're going to pick up where we left off before the midterm. So the first chapter we'll be doing is public opinion and political socialization. So in this chapter, we're going to look at, how do we measure how the public feels about political issues? Where does the public get their political points of view from? And so this chapter really focuses on how people develop their political points of view. So first, we'll talk about public opinion. Public opinion is, just what the public thinks about particular issues or sets of issues or, things that are being talked about in an election, things like that. I apologize. I need to mute all my stuff. Um, so, public opinion is very important, especially if you're running for office. Now, that is a difficult thing to measure. And so the best way we have to measure public opinion is polling. Now, polling is not a perfect science, and so we have to depend on polling. It's the most scientific way we do have to measure public opinion. But we'll talk about some of the problems with using polls. But when we conduct a poll, we essentially pick a sample, and this is who are we going to ask these questions to? And who we choose to ask these questions to, can influence the outcome of a poll. And so we call that our sample. A sample is the people we're asking questions to and trying to get an idea of, how that group of people feel about a certain thing. Like, let's say we're trying to conduct a poll about who people are going to vote for in the upcoming election in November. Well, if we want to get let's say that we want to find out how Texans are going to vote. And let's say that I only asked everyone in our class. That wouldn't be an adequate sample because in our class, all of you, you're from the same city, you're from the same region, the same region of the city. You're all relatively close in age. And so it wouldn't give us a good idea of how the state as a whole is going to vote. So we have to be careful about who we pick as our sample because that can skew the outcome of the results. One of the most well known polls is the Gallup poll, and this was developed by George Gallup. He's kind of credited as being the founder of modern day polling. And what he believed is that polling could speed up the process of democracy, that if our elected officials know how citizens feel about given topics, they can respond in a way that is in line with what the people want. Um, Straw polls were very popular back in the early 20th century. Straw polls essentially would use magazine subscribers or phone people with phones and things like that. They would poll those individuals to get an idea of how the public felt. The straw poll was first used in a magazine called Literary Digest, and the purpose was to try and predict the outcome of the presidential election in 1916. This is unscientific because there's not a lot of safeguards put in place to ensure that these results are accurate and legitimate. But it predicted that Woodrow Wilson would win, and that was a correct prediction. And this straw poll in this magazine was correct for about 20 years until they got to 1936, and it predicted that FDR would lose his election. And of course, that was incorrect. But there's, there's a lot of problems with depending on a poll like that. If we're just asking readers of this particular magazine, a magazine called Literary Digest, we're probably dealing with a very highly educated group of people, probably, I would say, upper income bracket, things like that. And so it's not necessarily representative of the public as a whole. So that's not a very scientific way to conduct a real poll. Now, here's some of the errors with that. One is the sample. Like we said, this overrepresented the upper middle class. So these are people who were doing really well, and the wealthy. And in 1936, they were drawing, names from the phone book and lists of automobile ownership. Well, you can think in 1936, both of those technologies were relatively new. And so only wealthier people were going to have a phone in their home, and own an automobile. So this kind of it skewed the poll towards the wealthy and the upper middle class and was not necessarily getting the point of view of the working class people. And then number two, this straw poll was sent out in September. So one thing that happens in the election cycle is what we call the October surprise. If a candidate has some dirt on their opponent, they're likely to release that information in October because that is right before voters are going to go vote. And so that will be fresh in their mind. And so if this poll was conducted in September, this would be before that happens. And so it can't take those late changes into account. And then three is a problem with all polling, is what we call self-selection. Only the most motivated people will participate in a poll when they're asked questions. In this particular poll, in the FDR poll, only 22% of the people who were mailed these questionnaires actually bothered to return them. And that happens today. Most of us, if someone calls our phone to conduct a poll, most of us don't even answer our phone if we see it's a number that we don't recognize, or if somebody tries to stop us while we're out, shopping or something and wants to ask us questions. A lot of times we don't participate, and so it's very difficult to get a high amount of people to participate in polling. George Gallup started a group called the Gallup Organization, and they have been one of the most successful groups in predicting the outcome of the presidential election. Their polls are often used by the news media. They've been used by newspapers for a very long time, and they're very trusted. They use scientific methodology and psychology in how they construct their polls, and they actually give a money back guarantee to newspapers that use their polls if they're wrong. Um, and in addition to that, we also have some universities that do polling. The American National Election Studies Polling Organization is conducted by the University of Michigan and Stanford University, and they've been doing this since 1952. It's partially funded by government, and they, try and measure public opinion and give that information to government so that they can do a better job in trying to do what the people actually want to see their government do. Now, prior to 2016, the biggest failure in polling was in the election of 1946. In 1946, all the polls said that Thomas Dewey was going to beat Harry Truman in that year's presidential election. And all of the polls said this. And so the newspapers were so confident that they went ahead and printed their newspapers for the day after the election early. And so this picture here, this is Harry Truman holding up the newspaper saying that he was going to lose the election when he's declared the winner. So this is a very iconic image, and it shows how polls don't always get things right. If you think about 2016, all of the polls told us that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. And technically, they weren't wrong because Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote. But the problem is that she did not win the Electoral College. And so, again, in 2016, we had a massive failure of polls all over the country because they did not necessarily capture the true outcome of that election. You could argue that they did get it right, but they didn't get it right in the way that mattered. Now, how do we design a valid poll? There's a lot of things that go into this, and this is kind of what you're political scientists, you're researchers. We spend a lot of time doing this kind of stuff because when we do our research, we have to consider a lot of things in how we ask questions and what information we're trying to get to. So, what are going to be the content and the questions? What is the question we're asking? And are we asking the questions in a way that is unbiased? If I want to, let's say I'm doing a poll about citizen attitudes about abortion, and I ask someone, do you support a woman's right to choose to have an abortion? Yes or no? And then I can ask a follow up question, why or why not? Those are valid questions. What we want to avoid are what we call push polls, where our questions try and push the person to give us the answer that we want to hear. So if we take the same issue like abortion, a push poll question would be if I was asking someone about abortion, do you support killing innocent children? That is a push pull question and a very biased and very heavy question. And it's one that nobody's going to answer yes to. So I'm pushing them to give me the answer I want so I can publish that information and say, see, most Americans do not support abortion. But it's not being honest because the questions were very biased and very leading. Number two, selecting a sample. We have to determine who are we going to ask these questions to. So we're looking at a population. Who are we focusing on? So like we said, if we wanted to try and see, conduct a poll about how citizens of the state of Texas are going to vote in the presidential election, then ideally I want to ask people at random and get as many different types of people to answer that question. Now, if I was, say, trying to measure how are women in the state of Texas going to vote in the election, then I would specifically ask women, but I would still want to be as random as possible to try and get as many perspectives as possible. The best way to do that is called random sampling. Just the picking a very large and very diverse group of people to answer these questions. That way, it is as representative of the public as possible. Stratified sampling, excuse me, is using census data to divide the population into regions and then randomly select people from those regions. And that is probably the most accurate way that a poll can be conducted. The problem we have today is how do we contact people to participate in polls? Um, the the most accurate way that polls used to be conducted was called random digit dialing, where pollsters would just pick up the phone and call people at random. That doesn't work as well today because there are a lot of rules about calling people's cell phones. There are, all our cell phones have, recognition technology to tell us it's a random number we don't know. Sometimes it'll tell us it's spam and things like that. So people are less likely to pick up their phone today and participate. Most accurate is doing in person interviews, in person questioning. But again, you have the difficulty of getting people to participate, and this is very expensive. If I was trying to, say, conduct a poll about the state of Texas, I would have to travel all over the state, and that can get very expensive. Exit polls are what we use on election night. You'll have pollsters set up at random voting sites all across the state, and they'll ask people as they're leaving, leaving the polling location from casting their votes, who they voted for. And that is, when we see these polls on election night, that's where that information is coming from asking people as they exit, the polling location, if they would be willing to tell us who you voted for, why did you vote for them, that kind of stuff. Internet polling is used today. The most accurate way to use internet polling is to use things like SurveyMonkey and stuff like that. You've probably taken, surveys on those before. Less accurate is to post a poll on a website or social media because you can't really control who is accessing that survey. And so it can skew your results in ways that you may not anticipate. There's a link to a video here, so definitely watch that video. It goes more into depth about the process of developing an accurate poll. Some of the problems we have with polling. One, the margin of error. When you see a poll, usually if you're looking at a poll online or in a magazine, it'll usually have a margin of error where it'll say plus or minus and then it'll have a number. That is the person who put the poll together recognizing that their poll is not 100% accurate. So if it says like plus or minus 2, that means that the percentages could be off by plus 2 points or minus 2 points. And that's the pollster being honest that their poll is not 100% accurate. If you see polls and they don't have a margin of error listed, they probably shouldn't be trusted because no poll can be 100% accurate. Number two, sampling errors. Did we do our best to ask as many random people as possible, or did we skew our data by asking too many people of the same demographic the questions that we wanted answered? Um, Three, limited respondent options. The answers available to those surveys do not provide enough range, or we just get yes and no. Yes and no is not always bad depending on the question, but if we're really trying to find out how people feel about an issue, we want to give them space to give us more information. So if we don't give them enough options to do that, and we're just getting yes and no answers, we don't really learn anything. We learn that yes, people support this, or no, people don't support this, but why? Why do they feel this way? And that's what we really want to find out. Four, lack of information. If you're asking people polling questions about something they have no knowledge about, you're probably not going to get accurate results. Like if you were to ask very technical questions or very obscure questions, people aren't going to have the information they need to give you accurate responses that are worth analyzing. Uh, Difficulty measuring intensity. Some issues are difficult to sum up in yes or no answers. Like if we ask people about the death penalty or abortion or things like that, that people have really strong feelings about and they may support it in some cases, but not in other cases, then our poll it has to become more complicated, more technical to capture all of that information. And there are ways to do that, but the people conducting the poll have to know the proper mechanisms for doing that. And then six is a big one today: lack of interest. People don't pay attention to government and things like that. Sometimes people feel like an issue doesn't affect them, or they don't have an opinion about it because they don't know about it. And that's something that pollsters have to deal with as well, is people just not being interested in the issue you're asking about. Now, how do we form our political opinions? Most of this comes through the process of political socialization. Political socialization is how we acquire the political beliefs that we have. These are a list of some of the most influential things on our political beliefs: our gender, our race, our ethnicity, age, religion, family, media, political leaders that we support and oppose, political knowledge. All of these factor into how we develop our political opinions and how they may change over time. One of the most important is family. A lot of people, their first exposure to government and political thought will be through their parents. Many people will grow up and they will hold on to the same political beliefs as their parents, or their parents may have a set of beliefs, and then you get older, you go to college, you learn more information, and then maybe your political beliefs will shift. But typically, our family will be our first kind of exposure to political thought, especially if our families really believe in voting and participating in the political process. The rest of these are influenced by lots of different aspects of our life. We know there are racial differences in the way that people support parties and support different issues. There are issues that are more important to women than men. As we get older, we have different concerns and different beliefs. Our religion is a big one as well. So there's a lot of factors that go into us developing our political point of view, and it's okay. Those may change over time, and that's fine because that means that we're taking in new information and responding to what we're learning. We should never be closed off and stop learning. We should always be open to new ideas or at least be able to defend the things that we believe in. And we've talked about that throughout the semester already. And this is just a cartoon to end this chapter here. This is just kind of a funny cartoon about polling. 4 and 5 don't trust Washington. 9 and 10 don't trust polls. We see this a lot today, and President Trump was good about tapping into this, about tapping into this feeling that people have today, where they feel like they can't trust their government, they can't trust the media, they can't trust information that they're being given, even polls. People are skeptical of those. And so we have kind of entered this unique time where we don't know who to trust. And, what we're going through right now is very representative of that. This coronavirus situation, we don't know who we should be listening to, how cautious we should be, and all that kind of stuff. So this is the importance of polling, though, is it gives us a picture of how the public feels, how the public feels about government and all that kind of stuff. So I definitely challenge you, while this is going on, while we're all cooped up in the house, pay attention to these polls, and especially as we get closer to the election, you're going to see more and more of these on social media and on the news and things like that.